Welcome to this video on HTML forms. So what I'd like to cover are the aspects of the HTML required to produce a form, like this example here. So it's the sort of stuff I'm sure you're used to seeing every day and filling out every day, where you ask for your details, name, email, contact numbers, various information, free text fields, checkboxes, radio buttons and drop down. So we'll run through some of the headline features here, see how this can be achieved via HTML. Okay, so here we go. So I'm in Visual Studio Code here, and I'll start this from scratch so that you can see there's no kind of magic involved here. So I'm going to create a brand new HTML file. So I'll just call this basic form.html, and takes us into the editor, flashing away there. So you may or may not be aware of this little trick. If you put the exclamation mark in there and then hit tab, it gives me the basics of a HTML document. So I'll just call this HTML forms, and let's put a H1 in here as well. So HTML form. Okay, right, so that gets us going. Right, so the main element that we need to get going is the form tag itself. So when you have a form, like in this example here, all of the form elements here are all inside of a form tag. So there's different HTML for all these different bits and pieces, but they're all inside of a form tag. You can have multiple forms per page if you want, but everything needs to be in a form tag. So let's start off with this then. So I'll use Visual Studio Code's really great emit feature here. So EMMET, if I just type in form, it's using the emit abbreviation. So if I just hit tab, it will add in a basic form for me. Now, just move my cursor in between those two elements, just space that out, because in here, this is where the form information, the different form field types are all going to live in this space between these two elements. So you won't get anything visual from this, it's just defining the extent of the form for HTML. So there's no kind of visual element when we view that in the browser. I guess I should just prove that for you. Let me just copy the path of this, hop back to my browser, and there you go. So there's nothing to see there at the moment, it's just the form element is inside of it. Now you might have noticed in Visual Studio Code it did automatically give the form field an action there. Now the action, what you'd put in there is the URL of somewhere where you're going to send this data to be processed. So it might be, for example, a JavaScript file or a PHP file or any number of different files that are set up server side to process that information. That's not something I'm going to cover in this video. It would require additional kind of server setup, so I'm going to leave that blank for now. But the other one to be aware of is method. So method dictates how this data will be sent from the form, and what we mean by that is what HTTP, what Hypertext Transfer Protocol method would be used. So in this case, that would be could be a get or a post, and what we would, if that was left out, it would default to get. Now what we mean by that is that's how the data is sent. We'll be able to see how a get works. Post is because it puts the data in what we call the query string. The post is a little bit more involved, it's hidden in something called the HTTP headers. Again, not massively relevant at this point until we get into how we would process this data. So by leaving that blank, I am basically setting it to get. Okay, so let's get into the actual creating form elements, and the one that's most commonly used is input. In actual fact, the input HTML tag can be used to create a whole range of different input types. You can see from Visual Studio Code there, it's given the option to create an email, a date, a colour, a checkbox, buttons, there's the files, there's loads of different features here. But if I hit tab, it will default to the most common of these input types, which is an input type of text. Let's have a look at what that will do for us. and it just gives us an input field like this where we can type stuff in. Okay, so that's all very well and good, but our user has no idea what's going on there in terms of what text should be typed in. So generally it's a good idea to provide these form fields with a label. So we have a label HTML element. Again, if I just type in label, hit tab, it puts the basics of a label tag in there. I'll come back to what this for does in a second. But let's say that we're asking them for their first name. We can type first name in like so. So the user would now see that in the form like so. Now, there's much more to do with this HTML input attribute tag here, because there's lots of attributes that we can add in. So input type of text gives us a single line text field, but we should also give this a name. So there's a name attribute, and what this equates to is what we call the name value pair. So when you send data from this form, what will be sent will be a name and then a value. So a bit like a field column and then a field value in a kind of Excel type of jargon. So I'm going to call this first name. So notice I've kept that all nice and lowercase, no white spacing or anything, because that's going to be used by my system somewhere. It's not going to be seen by the user. And then we could add another attribute in there. Now, this label, as well as provide a nice little label for the form field, it does provide additional help for people using assistive technologies, because the assistive technology will associate the label with the form field that we want to add in. And this for attribute is sitting here to help us do that. So if we say for first name, we then need to have a link between this for value and this input field, and that's done via ID. So we have an ID attribute down here. Let's call that first name. So this now links to that for attribute. So what does that do for us? Let's have a look. So there's my form field. Notice that this is my label, so when I click on this, it does put the focus into that form field, which is a nice little bit of usability. So it also helps with accessibility. Wherever possible, make it as easy as possible for users to fill out your form. Okay, so some other bits and pieces that we could look at here. I'm just going to close this down here so it gives a little bit more space, because there are other attributes that we can add in. So one, for example, is placeholder. And we could say enter first name. And that will provide this little text context here. So when we arrive here, if the user wasn't really sure what to put in there, it will hint, and as we start typing in, that would disappear. It's reformatting as I type stuff in here because I'm using an extension in Visual Studio called Prettier. So these are the different attributes I've got in there first of all. Let's add another one in. So there is also value. Now value would be the value that would be initially displayed in that value, so it's in that text field. So this is slightly different to placeholder, and it will overrule placeholder. Placeholder will only kick in if there is no value. So if we go back, we can see that the value is in there, and I could change that to something else. So you don't always set that. That would be set if you had a current value available for that field. So if you're editing your current information, for example, in this instance we're not, so I shall take that away. Okay, right, now one other thing I'm going to do on this one before we move on to another form element is I'm going to actually wrap this in a div tag. So I'm going to put a div tag on the outside there and have all of this inside of one like so. And so that's going to make life easier for us later on when we start formatting the layout of this form. Okay, let's add another form field in. So this pattern of having a div on the outside for formatting, a logical division, and a label and an input tag, I'm going to repeat something like this or similar for the other form elements. So let's add a email field in. So we'll say div, provide a little bit of space, and then we'll have a input first of all down here. So input. Now a few years back we got some new HTML attribute input types, and a really nice one is email. So if you're expecting an email address, you can use a type of email. Now let me give that a name of email. I'll come back to these name values in a second, and I'm also going to give this an ID of email. Now it seems really lazy, but each one of these is actually going to perform a different task, and we'll talk through what these are. Let's stick a label at the top here. Let's type email in there. So this is the for attribute which ties with this one, and let's ask them in here for their email address. Okay, so in terms of what that looks like, in our form we have another form field there of email address, and we can be adding the value in there, and the label gives us the focus, as you can see. So what do we get with this then? Well, this is going to help users fill out their email address. There's various kind of hints that it will be provided. I'll show you some in a second, but before we get to that I just need to put in an additional little, let's set this up so that we can submit the data. So I'll put a div down here, and I don't need a label. I'm just going to put another input tag, but this one is going to be a submit. Submit is a submit button, which you'll be familiar with on most forms. There are attributes associated with this. So for example, we could set the value of it to be send details, and what that is setting is the text that will appear on the button itself, on the submit button. Right, now we can actually test what we've got here. Excuse me, we've got an action, which means this data will be sent back to the same page because we're not giving it other information. We've got a method, which is how the data is going to be set, and as I say, it's going to use get in this instance. So let's give this a little whirl. Right, so we put our first name in there, and then we put an email address in here. Right, and then I'm going to send that. Now, when I send that, the page will refresh. You can see it zoomed out a little bit because I actually zoomed in on that one before I sent it. The important thing to note for later on, when you start wanting to process this data, you can see up here there is a name value pair. Now let me just temporarily put this in here so we can see what that looks like. So what you've got there is the name, first name, and then the value, Martin. And then we've got another, so that in our form was the name here, and our first name, and then the value I typed in of Martin. And then we've got an ampersand, because we've then got a name of email, which is our name here of email, and then we've got the value represented in this percentage 40 is equivalent to the @ sign when it's translated into a query string. So you can see that the importance of giving these things names, because that the name that you assign a form element then appears in the name value pair. Name value pair. Okay, we'll see more on that. Let's get rid of that there. Okay, now if I go back to my form again, just refresh, say that it would expect an email address in there. We can force it to check that there is one. So let me add it upon input here first of all. Again, this was a feature introduced a couple of years ago in a release of HTML called HTML5. So we put in an attribute of required. Now notice there's no required equals true, required equals 1, anything like that. So I call these Boolean attributes because it's just on or it's off. So if we put in required on our first name, what will happen is that when I try to submit that, it will say I need to fill that out. I can fill it out and then it would submit it. Now we can also use required on our email address down here, and what should happen there is that if this field is required and this one is as well, Okay, but because we put in an email, it wants an @ sign in there as well before it will submit it. So that's a nice handy feature. We get some what's known as client-side validation built into the browser. Now I just want to show you another little feature related to this. So I'm going to just switch things around a little bit here, because I want to show you what this would look like on a mobile device. So just bring my screen capture into view. It's quite difficult to show you this, but the best I can do really is to actually show you the form there on a phone, and one of these fields is set up for email. So when I click on it, you'll notice that what I get is a email friendly keyboard with an @ sign on it. Okay, see that? So that's quite clever. That was on an iPhone. Let's show you that on an Android device as well, which I'm currently locked out of. So there's the same form on an Android device. There's an email field. When I click on it, I get an email friendly keyboard. How cool is that? Okay, right, so these are definitely worth putting into your code. It's all about making it easier for the user to be able to enter the data into your form. Right, what other fields have we got then? So let's say that we wanted multiple lines of text rather than just a single line of text. So let's put a div in just to provide some spacing later on. And then I'm going to, well, let's put a label in first of all this time, because we will be doing that. And this is going to be just for comments. And then we'll put comments in here. Right, and so underneath, rather than there's been an input type of email, this time I'm going to use something called a text area. So just type text area into Visual Studio Code, hit tab, and notice it adds loads of attributes in. So we've got a name and an ID, which we've seen before. So again, that's going to be comments there, so that's the name of the name value pair, that's the ID tied to the comments, and then it's defaulted with these rows and columns because it's a multi-line text field, remember. So it gives me something like this. That's got whatever it was, 30 columns and 10 rows, and I can resize that if you wanted to by default to give yourself extra space. So that's a multi-line text field. You can also use required, you can use value on that, you can use placeholder, all of those are valid. An interesting thing with the text areas, you can put the value in there, but you can actually type stuff inside the tag here. So add stuff here, and that would appear inside of there. It's the same as adding it as a value, so either is valid. Okay, right, so that was fairly straightforward. What about some, what if you wanted a drop down list? So a drop down list, put a div in, and again let's have a label. So let's ask people how they heard about us. So let's put marketing, and we'll say, how did you find out about us? Okay, so that's our question. So this time I'd like a drop down list. So like a HTML list, which uses a UL and an LI, a drop down list has two components. So first of all, you have a select tag. Drop one of those in there. Notice we've got a name and an ID. You're probably guessing what I'm going to do here. I'm going to make those both the same. And then inside of here, we'll then have an option. So this will be the first option that they choose. Now notice we've got a value, and we've also got the ability to put something inside of the tag there. So let's say that they found us from a web search. We can put web. Let's stick another option in. Let's say that they found us by reference, a friend recommended us. Let's say friend, Stick a couple more in. Maybe they found us in a newspaper, or maybe it was an advert somewhere else. Let's take a look at the option tag in. So let's say ad. Ad. So that bus. So it was advert on the bus. Okay. Right. So that we've got 4 elements in our drop down list. There they all appear, like so. Okay. Now, what if you wanted these to be a little bit more user friendly? That's no problem, because although we've got the value there being the same as what appears in here, this is what the user sees in the drop down. This is what gets sent to be processed. So if I change this to web search and change this to recommendation from friend, change this to newspaper advert, and we change this to bus advert. So notice that these options are now different to the values. So the options is what will appear in the list, but the values is what will be set to be processed. So the values are part of the name value pair. So if I selected bus, the name value pair would be marketing equals bus. Let me show you that. So we will submit this. Martin Bob at test.com. We'll leave that blank, and then we'll pick bus advert and then send details. So up here it says marketing equals bus. So there are the name value pairs that were sent as part of that form submission. So we're not interested in this little tutorial as to what we do to process that data, but in building the actual form itself. But it's worth noting that importance of putting these names in, because that's the whole point of the form, is to retrieve the data to process it. Another interesting little feature with a drop-down list is you can put a attribute in on any of these options of selected. Now it's a bit like required in that it's standalone. It doesn't have selected equals yes or anything like that. So I've got that on friend, and I would put friend at the top. Okay, so it marks it as the selected item in the drop-down list. So that's entirely possible if you need to do that. Usually that's because your existing data would tell you that that was the option that they selected. Okay, right, so another really common form element is a radio button. So let's put a div tag in for this. Now I'm going to treat the label slightly different in this instance. So because the way that input tags work, radio tags work I should say, is they are grouped together. So we're going to have more than one radio button appearing here. So we need a label for each one. Let's show you by example. So I'm going to put in a input tag, and this is going to be of type radio. And let's give it a name, and let's say that this is going to be asking for gender, and we'll have a value that gets selected here, and then we'll put in M for male. Okay, so that is a radio button for male. Let's repeat that. So we'll put an input of radio, and we'll put in the name of gender. So this gives us our radio group. These two are now grouped together, but I need a different value. So we'll put in F for female. And we'll put in the third one, an input type of radio with a name of gender, and we'll put in a value of not applicable, not going to tell you. Okay, right, so we've now got 3 radio buttons grouped together by this name. Let's have a look at them in the form. There they are. Okay, you can see only one of them can be selected. This is why they're called radio buttons, because old FM, medium wave, long wave radios, you could only be listening to one of those waves, so as you pressed one button, the others will pop up. Problem is here, we don't know which one is which, so we need to label them. Now this gives you an opportunity to show you a different way to label. I'll put a label tag in, but I'm not going to use the for. I'm going to remove that, nicer Visual Studio Code to give me it, but I don't want it. And then I'm going to close the label after that first radio button, and then label this up as mail. And then I'll repeat this down here. So I don't want the 4, but I want the label to be wrapped around female. And then one last one, label. Don't want the 4. Let's wrap the label around here. Right, let's add the text in. So female. Right, so what have we got? I've done that. It's annoying. Doesn't matter, it'll be fine. Right, so we go back out here and refresh. So we've now got labels. So if we click on this, click here, you can actually click on the labels themselves, but you've got the additional ability to click on the labels. Okay, so radio button, use them where you've got more than one option and you want them to be grouped together, but only one option can be selected. Right, so moving on, let's stick another div tag in, and what we're going to do is we are going to add a checkbox in. So let's add a label in, and we'll say newsletter. I'll ask the question, sign up for newsletter. Right, great. So that's our label. We need an input. And this will be an input type of check box. So let's give this a name of newsletter. Let's give it an ID of newsletter. And then let's give it a value of, let's say, 1. Okay, why 1? Well, this is a checkbox, so it's either on or it's off. So most often, well, certainly what I do, and I'm not unique in this, is that we would just put a value of 1 in. It's either on or off, so we just put a boolean in. If this checkbox isn't ticked, no value is sent. Right, and then the newsletter ties these two together. So let's see this in action. There's our sign up for the newsletter. I'll get rid of this over here, so we start with a nice clean example, and I'll tick that. And we've got our validation in, of course. I'll just put a little chunk in there for now. And you can see there, newsletter equals 1. Okay, now if that wasn't selected, and we've got our dummy data going in, and we send, so no value sent for newsletter. Okay, so we can pick up its value. If it's sent, so as we said, it's 1, dead easy to pick up. Right. Okay. Now, one little thing when we're talking about checkboxes, this would apply to radio buttons as well. There is a Boolean standalone attribute of checked. So you don't say checked equals checked. You can just say checked. And what that will do is cheekily it will tick that box for you. Okay, which some unscrupulous websites will do for you. So you'll get newsletters for the rest of your days. So, but it's a perfectly legitimate bit of HTML. It's just in there because it might be the case you've ticked that box before. Therefore, let's tick it for you. Right, great. Now that's the kind of headline ones. There are others which I'll let you look at in some of the links that I'm going to point at. But I just want to format this a little bit nicer now. I'll show you how we can go about styling this. So, this is diving into the world of CSS a little. So I'm just, for ease, going to just create a document level style. And this could very easily be in an external style sheet. So, first up, the great thing about these labels is that not only do they make the form nice and rich, because you've got labels associated with text fields, is that they're really great for styling. Labels by default are what's known as inline. Notice they flow left, right, which means we get this jagged edge here because they've got each of these labels has got different widths. So the form looks a bit of a mess. But what we can do is we can say, okay, if you are a label, we would love you to be displaying yourself as a block. And that forces them to flow vertically down the page. And as a result, our form will immediately look a lot better, like so. So that that label now is a block element which forces the content underneath it. And that works pretty well, pretty much across the board. It might be argued that this perhaps we could change a little bit. Perhaps we'd want the radio buttons going across the page. That's fine, we could do that. Remember, these labels were set up slightly different because the label wrapped around the form element rather than using the for attribute. So things are a little bit different here. So let's give this a class, this div. Let's say this is a class of my radio buttons. So I'll now be able to identify these labels because they're in this div of my radio buttons class. So we'll say dot my radio buttons. If you are a label there, then do you know what? We'd like to display yourself back as inline. So that's going to overrule that rule above. So I'm going to refresh. These radio buttons are going to now spread across the page, which is arguably a more efficient way to lay those particular ones out. It's up to you, but that's how you could do it if you wanted to do it that way. I want to space these out a little bit. Maybe not too clear whether that is male or female. It's sitting between the two there. So let me just add in some margin on the let's say on the right hand side of that label. Let's put 20 pixels in. And you can see that space those out a little bit better because we put 20 pixels in here, so we can now clearly see which label is associated with which radio button. Okay, and then we'd have these divs in as well. So each of these form elements I've put in a div, so we could space that out a little bit better. So we could say, okay, if you're in the form and you're in div tags, you're in immediate child, then maybe we'll put a margin top and bottom of 10, left and right of 0. That spaces them out a little bit better. See the labels working nicely as we click on these different elements. So we've got ourselves a nice basic little form with some of the kind of headline features in there. There's other bits and let's say there's plenty of other bits and pieces related to forms for you to have a peruse at. To show you one last feature, this is field set. So you can put in a field set tag. And let me group that around these first two elements here of email and first name. Right, so these two guys sit in here. Got field set, and what they do is just literally group those two elements together. So it will draw this little box around them to group them. You can style the boxes if you want, but that's what it will look like by default. The idea being that you can break a form down into kind of logical chunks, which is what I've done in this example. So here's your personal details, feedback, marketing, etc. How did that text get up there? Well, that's what's known as the legend. So inside of a field set you can have a legend. We can say that this was personal details, and that would provide us with that effect where you have that. Okay, not everybody uses them. They perhaps won't look right in every case, but there is the opportunity to use that feature as well. So there is one other feature I would just like to quickly show you. It's similar to the likes of type email, and again this was a new feature introduced in the HTML5 world, and this is an input type of date. So if I just add in a div tag, and then let's put in a label, and I'll put in DOB there, just short for date of birth, and then we'll have a input tag, but this time it will be of type date. Now we could then add in the name of date of birth, and let's put in an ID of date of birth. And so this would be the name of the name value pair, and this is the ID to tie to the for. So what does this input type of date do for you? Well, it will give you a date picker like so. Now it's not going to work in all browsers, so you will be advised to check out Can I Use, where if we say date in there, and then we've got it'll be this one here, date and type, input types. So see, we've got good support in Chrome, not in IE11 though, but certainly in Edge and in Firefox. So quite a nice one, that input type of date, but do be aware that you would need a more modern browser in order to use it, and the date pickers will look slightly different in different browsers. Okay, so there you go, that's a quick introduction to HTML forms. Plenty more, which I'll provide in the links underneath, so thanks very much.